Okay, today's daf. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started. I know others hopefully will be joining. But today's daf in Masechet Menachot, we are actually continuing the discussion from yesterday. Yesterday we started discussing, well, not just yesterday, but including yesterday, the question of other things that you bring along with the mincha, and we got to salt, right? Torah says that I'll call on every karban mincha um, you should bring salt, right? B'melech timlach. Kol karban minchatcha b'melech timlach. And we learned yesterday that it wasn't just a karban mincha, that in fact this applied more broadly. And it meant basically that every karban, we had a little debate about what was included in the klal product klal, but pretty much every karban that was brought on the mizbeach that needed to be burned, that had wood, was required salt on it before you put it on the mizbeach. So including the birds, including the limbs, including the ketoret, according to the chachamim, right? So all and the levona, all of those things needed salt. Now, one of the questions we had yesterday was, what about the blood? Blood is put on the mizbeach. It's not burned on the mizbeach. It's just placed on the mizbeach. But blood is michaper, right? And blood is the final part, or really the most important part for many karbanot. And the question was, is that similar to the kmitza of the mincha? And that was one possibility. And we decided that that wasn't the case. But says the Gemara today, where am I? um, 10 lines from the top of Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph, right? Says the Gemara, why the only way you know that you don't have to add salt to the blood when you put on Mizbeach is because there's a pasuk. Says the Gemara now, 10 lines from the top of Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph, Taima, the reason that you don't have to put salt on the blood is the miyat akra lidam, that the pasuk said, don't put salt on your blood, basically, right? We had a pasuk that taught us that. But the implication is, and just stop me if it's not clear, because my screens are all messed up here. Halav hachi, if it wasn't for the fact that the Torah said don't put salt on your blood, hava mini dam leboy melech. I would have thought that before you put the blood on the mizbeach, you have to put salt on it. But how could that be? Right? If you put a lot of salt in something, first of all, it absorbs a lot of the blood, but that's not considered blood anymore. How do we know that? Damar Ziri Amar Rabbi Chanina is where Ziri quoted Rabbi Chanina as saying, Dam shebishlo, right? Let's say you take blood and you cook it. Eino over alav, you're not over, there's a prohibition in the Torah about drinking blood, about eating blood, right? But that's not true about blood that's been cooked. Now, again, this is a complicated discussion about the Yisurim of blood, but the basic principle is that Rashi understands here that's whether you're talking about blood of chulin, meaning blood of a regular animal that you shechted, or blood of kachim, if you eat it, the Torah is not mechayev you on that blood unless it's blood that can be put on the mizbeach. So the isser of karet at least, right, of blood, of eating blood, is only blood that can be put on the mizbeach and get a kapara. And if you cook the blood, it's not roy from the mizbeach anymore, and therefore you're not chayev for eating it, at least not chayev karet. That was what Ziri said in the name of Rabbi Chanina. And Rabbi Yehuda Amar Ziri, Rabbi Yehuda then quoted Ziri as saying, Dam shemocho, if you salt the blood, ain't overlav. You're not chayiv karet for eating it because you can't put it on the mizbeach. But if that's true, then how could you have thought that all blood needs to be salted to be put on the mizbeach? And just before we answer the question, Rabbi Yehuda Didei Amar, Rabbi Yehuda himself said, Evarim shetzalan behelam. Let's say you take the parts of an animal, right, that are supposed to be put on the mizbeach, and let's say you soleh, you roast them, you put them on a spit and you roast them before you put them on the mizbeach. That's not good. You can't say it gives the beautiful smell for the mizbeach. The smell of the mizbeach is raw meat, right? So that's a side point, obviously. But the point of Rabbi Yehuda is you're not allowed to cook things before you put them on the mizbeach. But the question is that how could you have thought that you're supposed to salt your blood before putting it on the mizbeach? If you salt it, it's not actually blood anymore. It's not blood to be put on the mizbeach. Answers the Gemara, Madatema, I would have thought that, when we say salted, it doesn't mean put a lot of salt on it. Maybe it's like a token amount, right? It's a symbolic salting. Mishtabe mashu mitzvah ba'alma. Throw a little bit of salt just to fulfill the mitzvah, and not enough to make it in not blood, but a tiny bit of salt, kamash malan, that you don't even do that. And that is what we concluded yesterday, that you don't put salt on the blood before you put it on the mizbeach. Okay, Gufa. Now we're up to the two dots. Perfect place to start, around 15 lines from the top, a third of the way down, I'll say. Gufa. Okay. Amar Zeiri, Amar Rabbi Chanina. Says Zeiri and Rabbi Chanina, Dam shepishlo, if you boil blood up, Eino over love. You're not chayav. Again, the prohibition is that you're not chayav karet for eating blood if it's been cooked before you eat it. And Rashi, as Rashi explained, again, it's not really our Gemara. It's a elsewhere Gemara in Kritot, pretty much that because you can't put it on the mizbeach because it's no longer considered to be the pure blood. It's the only issur of eating blood is blood that otherwise, in some other context, would have been put on the mizbeach. So that's what Zeiri said. Now, Yativ Rava v'kamal hashmaita. So Rava repeated this statement of Zeiri and asked Abaya, right? Eitvei Abaya. Abaya said, well, what happens if it's hikba et adam, right? Now, hikba is blood that's kafeh. It's not coffee, right? But it's blood that's I don't know if the English I here mine says curdled, but meaning it becomes hard, right? So it's no longer liquid blood. It's like a jelly, right? So if blood becomes like a jelly, the achalo, and you eat it, oh, shehimchata chelev ugamo. Now this is talking about chelev. Remember, chelev of an animal, you're not allowed to eat the fats of certain animals. Let's say you what's it called? You melted it, right? So it's no longer solid, it's liquid, and and you swallowed it, chayav. In those cases, even though it's not the blood is hard, it's a jelly, or the fats are soft, they're now a liquid, even though they change state in chemistry, they're still chayav for eating it, right? So now asked Abaya, that seems to be very problematic according to you. You just said that blood that's cooked you're not chayiv. But this is actually a Tosefta, and Kritut says in a Braita that if blood becomes hard, you're still chayiv. Answers a Rava to Abaya, Lokasha, it's not a contradiction. Kanchik baba or kanchik baba chama. There's different ways that blood could become solid. Either you can cook it in a fire, and if you cook it in a fire, or means a fire, then it's no longer considered blood, and you're at least not chayiv karet for eating it. But if it was in the sun, kachik b'chama, you left it out to sit in the sun, and it sort of sat there and got hard, that you'd still be chayiv. Why? Because ba'or, if you boiled it, lo hadar, then you're never going to turn it back into its pure form of blood. But b'chama hadar, but if you leave it out in the sun and then it gets cold again, or the other way, right? It cools down, no longer is hot, then it will turn back into blood, right? Says the Gemara, so what if it turns back into blood? Remember with kachim, b'chama nami lema, even if the blood became hard in the sun, you should say, hov idchi idchi, right? Once it became changed, it's changed. So what if you can turn it back into its original state? With the kachim, with karbanot, and in this case, we're comparing it to a karban, because right, in order for blood to be chayiv, it has to be something you put on the mizbeach. Once it was pushed off, idchi means disqualified, it should be pushed off. Rabbi Mani mi Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Mani actually asked Rabbi Yochanan this exact question, where I guess around half of the way down. Rabbi Mani asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question: Dam shekarash ve'achalomo. If blood becomes hard, right? Karash again means it congeals, it becomes solid, and you eat it. What's the halacha in terms of chiyuv karet? And Amalei said to him, Hoel v'nitcha yidacha, that since you can no longer use it as a karban now, because blood has to be liquid in order to be put on the mizbeach, and this is now solid, therefore the prohibition of eating the blood is no longer a chiyuv karet. And so you see from here that even though later you're telling me that since it can go back into its original state, it's still considered to be blood. Here, clearly Rabbi Yochanan says that's not the case. Ishtik, so he did not have an answer, right? Rava was stumped by Abaya. Said Abaya, well, I'll help you out, Rava. Amrlei, maybe Dilma, maybe Vadai, maybe what we're really referring to in this Braita, which makes it sound like you're still chayav, is kan bechatot chitzonot, kan bechatot pnimiot. It depends on whether you're talking about blood that would have been used outside, meaning in the mizbeach hachitzon, or whether it's blood that would have been used in the mizbeach hapnimi. What's the difference? If you recall, when you put blood on mizbeach hapnimi, right, the halacha is that you're supposed to take the blood with your finger and put it on the corner of the mizbeach, right? So it says you dip your finger into the blood and put it on the mizbeach. Obviously, if the blood is not liquid, you can't dip your finger into it, right? So once it becomes solid, it's no longer usable for the mizbeach hapnimi. The Mizbeach Chitzon, it never says dip your finger into it. It says pour it onto the Mizbeach. So maybe even if it's solid or let's say jellyish, you can pour it onto the Mizbeach. So maybe there's a big difference between whether you're talking about blood that was meant to be used on the the inside where it has to be a liquid to be used. And once it congeals, it's no longer usable. And therefore, if you drink that blood, you're not chayiv karet, or maybe not drink it, take it with a spoon. You're not chayiv karet. But the blood that was meant for the chatat that, or the carbon that's outside, the chatat that's outside, you don't necessarily need to have it to be liquid. It could just be jelly, right? So maybe that's the difference. That's what Abaya said to Rava. And Rava said, oh, good point. Amar, Rava said, At kartan milta dam Rav Chisda. You reminded me of something that Rav Chisda told me, because Rav Chisda was quoted as saying, what did Rav Chisda say? Dam shekarash b'chataot ve'achalo chayav. If you have blood that became congealed from a carbon chatat, and chatat means usually a chatat outside, then, and you eat it, you're chayav. Because even though it's congealed, it still can be put on the mizbeach. Because what does the Torah say about the blood outside? V'lakach v'natan. Take the blood and put it on the mizbeach. It doesn't say anything about dipping your finger into it. So let's say it's jelly. You can pick it up and put it on the mizbeach. Amarachmana. Bar lekicha netinahu. You can pick it up and put it on the mizbeach. But if it's talking about blood of a chatot hapnimiot that became congealed v'achlo and you ate it, you're patur. There, you're not chayav because it could be put on the mizbeach. V'taval v'hizam arachmana. The Torah says, dip your finger in and sprinkle it. In order to do that, you need liquid. And this is not a liquid because it's congealed, and therefore you can't dip your finger in and sprinkle it. And so there is, in fact, if Chisda actually came up with this idea, good job of buying in making it up on your own or thinking about it on your own. But it's true that I've already heard this, said Rava, from Rav Chisda. And so that was, in fact, a support for what Abaya innovated that Rav Chisda had already said. But says the Gemara, by the way, Rava didei amar, but Rava himself doesn't agree with that. And Rava says, I would say, afilo b'chataot hapnimiyot v'achlo chayav. Even if you took a chatat from the pnim, and the blood of that chatat congealed, and then you ate it, you would be chayav for eating that blood. You can't put it on the mizbeach, because you have to dip your finger into it and put it on the mizbeach. It doesn't matter, says Rava, because the truth is, although for chatat hapnimit, you can't put it on the mizbeach, if it was the equivalent chatat outside, you could put it on the mizbeach, and that's enough, says Rava. Hoil v'kenegdo ra'oi b'chatot hachitzonot. Because since kenegdo, meaning an equivalent case, sure, this happens to be a chatat pnim. And a chatat pnim needs to be liquid. But since a chatat chutz of the same animal or the same species of blood would have been able to be put on the mizbeach, you're chayav for eating this blood. Says Rav Papa, if that's the logic, that you're chayav for eating something that is supposed to be inside because it could have been done on the outside, then I could take that logic much further and talk about a non-kosher animal. I could talk even about hilkach dam chamor shekrash v'achlo chayav. Even blood of a donkey, which obviously you never bring a donkey on the mizbeach, but still, even though you can't literally take the blood of a donkey and put it on the mizbeach, you should say, "Ho kenegdo roi b'chatot achitzonot." That since the equivalent to blood of a donkey in an animal of a chatat that's supposed to go on the mizbeach would be considered blood, eating it is chayav karet. And so the principle, says Rava, is that you don't actually have to put this blood on the mizbeach. It has to be equivalent to similar blood that would be put on the mizbeach, and therefore even blood of a non-kosher animal that, of course, is never put on the mizbeach, it's because the equivalent of a kosher animal on the mizbeach hachitzon is doable. You'd be chayav for eating that blood. So that's Rava's opinion. So it's a machloket at the end of the day, but that is how Rava comes out. Now, obviously, we're on a sidetrack here, side quest, as we would call it, right? Learning about the chiyuvim of blood, which are obviously not the topic of Masechet Menachot. But says Gemara, we never can miss up an opportunity to go on another side quest. And now we are sixth to the last of the narrow lines. Is that what we're up to? Amar of Gidol, right? Amar Ziri. Says Rav Gidol Amar Ziri, while we're on the topic of blood, I just want to point out to you, right? Remember, again, this has nothing to do with Menachot. But the point, says Ziri, of Rav Gidol, the name of Ziri, is that, remember, if a person goes into a mikvah, they're supposed to not have anything on their skin that's separating between them and the water of the mikvah. If they have dirt on their skin, they're not tahar, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of discussion in Masechet Mikvaot about what's a chatzitza, what you're makbid on, what you're not makbid on, what you mind, etc. But says Zeiri, dam, if you think about blood, if you have blood on your skin, bein lach bein yavesh chotzitz, or not just your skin, right? Your clothing, if you're being told your clothing or your pots, blood is whether it's moist blood, right, liquid blood, or it's dry blood, so it's congealed, dried blood on skin, let's say, or on a clothing, it's a chatzitza. I asked the Gemara, is that really true? What about the following Tosefta Masechet Mikvaot Meitve? It says in the Mikvaot, Hadam v'hadiyo v'hadvash v'chalav. All these liquids, blood, ink, honey, milk, all of those things, yiveshim, if they're dry on a person's skin, they're chotzitzim. But lachim ain't chotzitzim. If they are moist, they're not a chatzitza, presumably because they just basically get washed off, so the water goes there anyways. Answers the Gemara Lokasha. Well, it's a little bit more complicated because blood or any moisture, sometimes even if it's a liquid, it's stuck to you, right? There's liquids that don't wash off easily. And hadis sarich, hadilo sarich. One is where it sticks to you, and one is where it doesn't stick to you. So obviously, the difference is again nothing to do with our menachot. But if the blood sticks to you, then it is considered a chatzitza, and if it doesn't, it's not considered a chatzitza. Okay, so that is the end of our discussion for today about blood, and we're up to the two dots, second to last of the narrow lines on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. Back to our Mishnah, right? Or at least our sugya. So yesterday we had a whole discussion about what kind of salt, or not what kind of salt, that salt is needed to be added to a karban mincha, and we learned it from the pasuk of kol karban minchatcha b'melach timlach, right? Says the Gemara, why does we say the word timlach? Right, the word timlach is an unusual word. First of all, it's repeated because it says b'melach timlach, right? But why say a word timlach, which is a passive saying, right? You shall have done it, right? So not passive, right? It's active. Says where what does that come in and tell you? Look at Tanya. There's a Braita, in fact, that darshans this pasuk. It says in the Braita, b'melach. It says kol karban minchatcha b'melach. So if you just said put salt on it, yachol tivonehu. I might have thought, no, we don't know what the word tivonehu means right now. The Gemara is going to ask in a second, but I'm going to give you a clue. It means put a lot of salt onto it, right? Build it up with salt, let's just say. You would have thought put a ton of salt on it. Talmud Lomar timlach. Therefore, it says timlach, okay? Which implies put a little bit of salt. Again, we're going to, in a second, ask how we know all of this. E timlach. Now, if it just said the word timlach, I might have thought, well, you just can use salt water. Yachal b'mei melach. You don't need actual salt crystals, right? You could just put salt water, so it's salty. Talmud Lomar ba melach. Therefore, it says melach, it has to be salt, but you don't only put a little bit of salt. Salt it. Don't crush it with salt. We'll see what that means in a second. And continues the Braita, v'lo tashpit melach, right? This is the other pasuk. Don't destroy, don't ignore the salt, basically. What that means is, havei melach she'ena shovetet. Bring salt that never rests. What does salt that never rests mean? So there's a lot of questions about this, but the simplest way I think to understand it is that there's different ways to get salt, right? Now, I don't know if you know where salt comes from, but it's not a supermarket, right? So salt, obviously, there's some salt, which we're going to see in a second, which we call melech sdomit, which is where you just go to the water and you pull out crystals of salt, right? So if you go to the Yam HaMelech, which we call melech sdom, right, there's always salt there. It's always salty. But most salt is gotten from salt mines, where you dig down and you get basically salt that has been dried over many, 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 I don't know, centuries, right? And so you obviously can't do that on Shabbat. So you might have thought that you can only bring melech that doesn't rest, right? Meaning ezuzazu melech sdomit, meaning only melech that comes that's always present. Minayin shem lo matzah melech sdomit. How do you know if you can't find salt from the Yam HaMelech or from a salt flat? Shemevin melech isterokanit. You can bring melech isterokanit. I don't know what the source of that word is, but isterokanit means melech that comes, Rashi says, from the ground, meaning from quarries of salt. How do you know that? Which, of course, you can't do on Shabbos, but how do you know that you can do that? Talmud Lomar, takriv. Takriv tells you, takriv kolshu, that you can bring any salt. And takriv mikol makom, you can bring salt from any place. And takriv afilu b'Shabbat, you're in fact, even if you have no salt for your karban, remember, a karban is docha Shabbat, the salt is also docha Shabbat. And takriv afilu b'tumah, You remember, again, a karban is allowed to be brought b'tumah if you have no alternative. You can even bring the salt if it's tameh, because the salt is an essential part of the karban. You can get it even on Shabbos, even b'tumah. All of this is permitted for salt. That's the Breita. Now, says the Gemara, what do we mean? You would have thought tivoneu, which I said meant put a lot of salt. What does that mean? My tivoneu, or the fourth wide line on the bottom of Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. What does tivoneu mean? Amar Rabba Bar Ula Hachikamar. You might have thought Yachol Yitbonenu Ketevin Petit. Maybe it means you mix it like straw into clay. You know, when you take straw and you put water in it, you mix it up really well. Maybe the flour and the salt have to, or, sorry, the oil and the salt maybe have to be mixed together so that it's actually like a paste with salt. Amalei Abaya said Abaya, well, if you meant that, you should have said yitzbonenu, which means build it up. Amar Abaya, what the question was, yasenu kibinyan. Maybe we think you make it like a binyan, like a building, meaning you have to add layer on top of layer, says Gemara, and meaning put many layers of salt. Amalei Rava, yivinenu mibayle. Then it doesn't say yitzbonenu. It should have tivoneu, sorry. It should have said yibaneu. You build it up. Now, Amar Rava, what we might have thought is yachol tivuneu. You might have thought tivuneo. Now, what does tivuneo mean? My tivuneo. Amar Ravashi, tivuneo, interestingly, comes from the word bina, right? Bina means understanding, right? When you try to understand something, I mean, you give an explanation for it. So you might have thought that basically you're giving a little bit, well, it's not so clear what this means. Let me say that. But Rashi says, Rashi doesn't say whether it means a lot or a little, but we understood it to mean a lot before. Yachal yitembo tam kibina. We might have thought that you put a lot of it into it so that it basically changes the way the thing tastes. So that you, just like when you understand something, this is, again, a little bit of what Rashi seems to be saying. When you understand something, you put bina into something, you get a clarity of what's going on. You might have thought that putting the salt in should change the whole taste of the thing, meaning you put enough salt into it that the whole mincha tastes salty or carbon or whatever you're doing. Talmud lomar timlach. Therefore, it just says put a little bit of salt in. It's a seasoning. It's not a change in taste. So let's talk practically. How much salt do you put into your carbon? Says the Gemara, 2 lines in the bottom. Mevi ha'ever, we're talking here about the limbs, which is easier. You take a piece of the meat, v'noten alav melach, and you put salt on one side. V'chozer v'hofcho, and then you turn it over, v'noten alav melach, you put salt on the other side, and that's all you need. You don't need to soak it, you don't need to put layers, you don't need to let it sit for 10 hours. You just put salt on one side, you turn it over, put salt on the other side, and you throw it on the mizbeach. U'ma'aleu. You put it on the mizbeach, and says Abaya, the same thing is true. The kedera, the same thing is true when you're putting salt on your meat in order to eat it. That's what you got to do also, right? Now, this is a very interesting question. Probably most people understand, and we're going to have a lot about this in Masechet Chulin, that when you take meat from an animal before you eat it, you're supposed to salt it, right? And we're going to have a huge discussion about how much salt to do. But what this implies is that it's very similar. All you have to do is you put salt on one side, you turn it over, put salt on the other side, and then you could cook it. Okay? Now, it's complicated, I would say, just because there's other girsaot here, and there's some that have a girsa here that instead of saying b'chein lekidera, the girsa should be b'chein letzli. The same is true when you roast it, which is we're going to learn in Masechet Chulin. There's different criteria for how much salt you put on something when you roast it or when you cook it. So again, this is not our main sugya here, but our girsa is v'chein lekidera, which implies it's only for that one. Again, in Chulin, we'll get to this in Daf Kuf Bet, so we got a little bit of time until we get there. Anyways, turn the page to Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Bet. Tanu Rabbanan. Says the Breita, while we're talking about the salt, I want to point out something very interesting to you, which is that think about where does the salt come from, right? So we're going to discuss for the rest of today's daf where the salt comes from, but presumably the salt belongs to Hektish, right? Hektish has got these big tubs of salt, and you come to bring your karban, you take salt from Hektish and you put it on the Mizbeach. Now, you're not allowed to use things that belong to Hektish until they've done their work. So says the Breita, if you take the salt from Hektish, you put it on your piece of meat that's going on the Mizbeach, that salt still belongs to Hektish. And if you take that salt off the meat and eat it or put it on your soup, you're chayiv mi'ila, right? Because it's not yet done its duty. Its duty is to put it on the fire. But if the salt falls off the meat onto the ground, then it's no longer functional. You can't use it anymore for the meat. And basically, you've done the mitzvah and you can take it. There's no me'ila anymore. So let's read that in the Braita. Tanu Rabbanan, the top words of Chaf Aleph Bet. Melech shal gabi Aver. If the salt is still on the limb, on the piece of meat, before it's put on the Mizbeach, ma'olinbo, you're chayv me'ila if you use that salt. But if it's shalgabi kevesh, if it falls onto the ramp, or Rosh Hashanah Mizbeach, or actually falls onto the Mizbeach, ein ma'olinbo, because basically you poured the salt onto the mincha or onto the meat, and then it fell off it. You're not going to use it again. There's no more me'ila. Amr of Matzna Mikra, how do you know that after you put the salt on the meat, it's still not done its mitzvah, and you're chayv me'ila? It's based on this interesting pasuk in Yecheskel. The pasuk in Yecheskel says, "V'kraftem lifnei Hashem," bring the karban in front of Hashem. V'shlichu hakohanim aleim melech. The kohanim will throw salt onto the karban. V'halu otam olal Hashem. They will bring them meaning the meat and the salt, as an olah. So you see that until it's brought as an olah, it's still considered to be a karban of hektish. Tanur Rabbanan. Now let's continue that from the Mishnah in Shkalim, which I know a lot of us really love Masechet Shkalim. So if you remember, in the end of Masechet Shkalim, there's a discussion that they made a condition. They made a Tanai Beit Din al hamelach v'al ha'etzim shiyu hakohanim na'otim bahem, that the salt that was donated to the Beit HaMikdash and the wood that was donated to the Beit HaMikdash, the Kohanim are allowed to get benefit from those things. They're not considered to be, although they're hektish, they made a condition that the Kohanim are allowed to use them. Now, says Shmuel, what does it mean the Kohanim are allowed to use it? Amar Shmuel, the Kohanim can use the salt to put on their karban, but they can't use the salt to eat their karban, right? Meaning the karban that goes on the Mizbeach, they can put salt on it. But then remember, the Kohen gets a piece to eat. He can't get salt from the hektish and use that salt to make his meat taste better. That's what we think. So we think right now that when Shmuel said the karbanam, what he meant was the melach karbanan, to salt their karban, and le'achol meant achilat kachim. Asking, where is that true? I don't get it. Hashta limloch orot kachim yavina. And remember, the kohanim also get the skins of the animal. And one of the ways you prepare skins of the animals, you put salt on them, which draws out the blood and the moisture, right? And allows you to start making your skin into parchment or to clothing or whatever you're doing with it. And we're going to see in a second that the Kohanim are allowed to use salt from Hekdesh to salt the skins that they get from a karban. Well, if you can use the salt for the skin, which is it's not a mitzvah to use the skin, lachilat kachim lo yavina, shouldn't we give them salt to eat the kachim? It's a mitzvah to eat the kachim. The Tanya, now how do we know you're allowed to get salt for the skin? Because this is another braita, it's a tosefta, nims'eta omer. This is in Tamid, if you recall. Right? The braita, the tosefta explains, B'shlosha mikomot hamelech nituna. There were 3 places where the salt was placed in the Beit HaMikdash, right? Where are the 3 places? The Lishkat HaMelech, there was a lishka of the salt, which is, it's not really clear what this is. Tosfos is a little bit bothered here. We call this something else. In Masechet Midot, Tosfos says we call that Lishkat HaParva. But either way, the Lishkat HaMelech, we're just going to stick with that, and another time we can talk about the Lishkaot in the Mizbeah, in the Beit HaMikdash. But there was a lishka's a chamber where they had salt. That was the salt chamber. And there was a container of salt al gabi kevesh on the ramp. And there was a container of salt, Rosh Hashanah Mizbeach, on top of the Mizbeach. The Lishkat HaMelech, in the chamber of salt, the big one, Sham Mochin Arot Kachim, you would use that salt for the skins of the kachim, which is the proof that you're allowed to use salt for the skins of the animals. The second thing says the Braita is Agabi Kevesh, on the ramp, Sham Mochin Et Evarim. Before they would bring the pieces of the animal up to the Mizbeach, they would put salt on it at the bottom of the ramp. And Berosh Hashanah Mizbeach, on the top of the Mizbeach, Shesham Mochim HaKometz V'Halavona V'Ketoret. That's where they would add salt to the light things, to the kometz of the mincha, the lavona, the ketoret, and the minchat kohanim, minchat kohen Mashiach, minchat nisachim. These are the light things, right? The menachot of the kohanim that are burned on the mizbeach. So as opposed to a regular mincha where you only burn the kometz, but with the minchat kohanim, there was no kometz. You put the whole thing. And the minchat kohen Mashiach, the minchat nisachim, and the olat ha'of, and the birds that were burned on the mizbeach, right? So what you see from that braita at least is that you're allowed to use the salt in order to put salt on the skin you get from a karban. If you can put the salt on the skin from a karban, why can't you put the salt on the meat that you're eating from the karban, which is fulfilling the mitzvah of the karban? Says where you're right. When Shmuel said that you're allowed to use salt the karbanam, he didn't mean for bringing your karban on the mizbeach. He meant for eating the karban. Elamayla karbanam lachilat karbanam. And when he said you can't use the salt for other eating, my la achila, he meant achila dechulin, right? Let's say you brought a sandwich from home for breakfast, right? And you have a nice, delicious tuna fish sandwich. You want to add some salt to that. You're not allowed to use the salt from hektish for your tuna fish sandwich. Says Gemara, of course not. Chulin pshita, right? In what world would you have imagined that you're in the Beit HaMikdash, you're like, oh, I forgot my lunch. Let me grab some salt to make my potatoes better. Says my boy Hatam, why would you be eating chulin anyways in the Beit HaMikdash? And why would you be using the salt? Says Gemara, because um, afal gav, this is really a question. An answer. Afagav damar yochlu. Remember, we said that the word of a kohen, bnei Aaron ubanav yochlu, right, meant yochlu imach chulinu truma kadesh nechal dalasova, right? We know that you're allowed to bring your own food into the Beit HaMikdash, and we learned it from a pasuk yochlu. Right? Let's say you go to the Beit HaMikdash and you're like many kohanim, and you feel like I'm just eating meat all day long. This would be much better if I had a hamburger bun and some ketchup and some mustard, right? The pasuk tells you you're allowed to do that. Yochlu means you can bring your chulin and your truma to make, and your lettuce and your tomato to make your karban more appealing. But it doesn't mean you can take salt from the Beit HaMikdash. We would have never thought you can take salt from the Beit HaMikdash. Says Gemara, so we really leave that sort of open. Like, why in the world would you have thought that, or maybe this is the answer, that even though you're allowed to bring your own food from home, you can't take salt from the Beit HaMikdash to make your sandwich better, right? You can only put salt on the meat, not on your potatoes that are next to the meat. It says Ravina to Rav Ashi, on this last point, that remember, now we're understanding Shmuel. Where are we? I guess around halfway down, right? Amalei Ravina the Rav Ashi, says Ravina to Rav Ashi, Hachanami Mistavra. This explanation of Shmuel makes the most sense. Because again, I would take a step back and remember what Shmuel said, right? The Mishnah, or the Braita, it's actually a Mishnah in Shkolim, said that they made a T'nai. The T'nai that Beit Din made was that the Kohanim are allowed to get benefit from the wood and the salt, right? Even though you would have thought they're not allowed to because it belongs to Hektish, they're allowed to get benefit from the wood and the salt. And what did that mean, said Shmuel ultimately? That they can use the salt of Hektish to salt their karban that they're eating. Right? They get a piece of the chatas to eat, they can put salt on it. Says Ravina to Rav Ashi, this in fact makes sense. Hachanami mistava. This makes sense, and in fact, they're allowed to take salt for their karban, right? For eating their karban. Because if you thought, as we initially did, that the t'nai was that the Kohanim could take the salt from the Beit HaMikdash to put on the karban, to put on the Mizbeach, then why would you need a condition of Beit Din to allow that? Then Taima Da'atni Beit Din, the only reason the Kohanim can put salt on their karban is because Beit Din made a t'nai. Hello, Atni Beit Din lo, but if Beit Din had not made a condition, they couldn't? I don't get it. Hashta li Yisrael Yavinan. We give salt to every Yisrael who walks into the Beit HaMikdash. We give them salt for their karban. The Kohanim lo yavinan, so you'd think that the Kohanim don't get the salt. I mean, the Kohanim for sure should get it if the Israelim get it. How do we know that Yisrael gets salt? The Tanya. Because the Braita said very clearly, and now we're getting back to Mincha here, finally. The Tanya, as the Braita said, I'm going to find our place, but it's the first word on a line. It's a little hard to tell where. I guess the 20th or so last narrow line. Says the Braita, Yachal, you might have thought, Ha'omer harei alai mincha. Person says, I'm going to bring a karban mincha to Beit HaMikdash, right? So you bring flour, you bring oil, you bring spices. You might think you have to also bring salt. Yachal yavi melech mitoch beito. You might think you got to bring salt too. Kederach shemivi levona bitoch beito. You got to bring the spices from home. How do you know you don't have to bring the salt? V'dinu. It should be a kal v'chomer. Nemar hevi mincha hevi melech. It says you have to bring a mincha. It says you have to bring salt. V'nemar hevi mincha hevi levona. It says you bring a mincha, you bring levona. Just like the levona mitoch beito, just like the levona you bring from home. Af melech mitoch beito. So you should supply your own salt. Your own salt for your karban mincha. It says that's the Braita's first statement. Says the Braita, well, but maybe it's something different. Oh, klach l'derech zo. Or maybe think about it differently, because you're right. It says nemer hevi mincha ve'hevi melech. It says bring a mincha, and the Torah says you have to bring salt with every mincha. But you know what else you have to bring with every mincha? You have to bring wood, because otherwise a mincha will not burn unless you put wood, right? But nemer hevi mincha ve'hevi eitzim. Just like the Eitzim Mishal Tzibor. Now, we don't yet know how we know this, but tomorrow we're going to learn in the Gemara that the wood always comes from the Tzibor, right? The wood is a public utilization. So Ma Eitzim Mishal Tzibor, Af Melech Mishal Tzibor. Just like the wood comes from the tzibor. Again, we'll see. We talked a little bit yesterday about bringing wood, but we'll see how we know that. Just like the wood has to come from the tzibor, the melech, the salt should also come from the tzibor. So we're unsure now, right? You bring a karba mincha. With every karba mincha, you have to bring spices, you have to bring salt, and you have to bring wood, at least, right? Says the Gemara, what is the status of the salt? Should the salt be like the spices that you bring from home, or should the salt be like the wood that's provided by the public? How do we know? Says the Gemara, Nira Lemitomeh, because this is the Braita continuing. Let's see whether the salt is more similar to the wood or to the spices. Danin davar noeg b'chol azvachim. On one hand, I would say, compare something that is similar to all, that's common in all zvachim, which is salt, midavar noeg b'chol zvachim, which is wood. Don't bring into this that should be compared to the spices. You don't bring spices by all carbonot. There's no spices by a ola or shlamim or a oaf, right? Spices are only by a mincha. So on one hand, it seems that you should compare salt to wood. Or maybe go the other way. Think about it. The mincha has certain things that are put in the same kli, right? And that is the spices, but also the salt. The wood is never put into the same pot as the mincha. Therefore, says the Braita, we don't know what to say. So we have a pasuk. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk comes and says, Brit Melech Olam. Right? Where am I? Did I read the right pasuk? Yeah, the second to last narrow line. Talmud Lomar Brit Melech Olamhu, that the salt is a treaty, a brit of salt. Right? Now, what does that teach us? Because La'alanu Omer, later on, we're going to say, actually later on, it's earlier in Vayikra, but we're going to say, Me'et b'nei Yisrael Brit Olam. This is talking about the Lechem HaPanim. Right? The Lechem HaPanim are brought, Me'et b'nei Yisrael, a Brit Olam. Ma'lala Mishal Tzibor, just like the word Brit by Lechem HaPanim is referring to something that's brought from the community, right? Because it says Me'et B'nai Yisrael. Don't bring it from an individual, not from the Kohanim. Bring it from all B'nai Yisrael. And therefore, just like that is Bam Mishal Tzibor, Afka Mishal Tzibor. Here too, the salt that is brought on a karban is brought from the public. And therefore, that is how we conclude basically that the salt that is brought with the karban is brought from the tzibor. And just to add, they had to make a t'nai that the Kohanim are allowed to use that salt for their eating the kachim that they eat after the karban is brought. Because you might have thought, only things that go on the mizbech can we use the public, and they made a condition that the Kohanim can use that salt to eat the karban chatat or whatever karban they're eating in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, that is the first, I'd say, or second explanation of Shmuel. Says Rav Mordechai to Rav Ashi, one last halacha for today, and this is a Gemara that we've had before. Says Rav Mordechai, some of us have had before, said Rav Mordechai to Rav Ashi, there's a whole other way to think about this. And the whole other way to think about this is that the reason that they had to make a condition and said that the Kohanim are allowed to use the salt, right, and the wood, is because of the statement of Ben Buchri. Now, what was the statement of Ben Buchri? We'll read it in a second. Hachik Amar Rav Shisha, Amalei Rav Mordechai to Rav Ashi. So I said Rav Mordechai to Rav Ashi, Hachik Amar Rav Shisha Breder Ravidi. Rav Shisha Breder Ravidi explained that Shmuel's statement was L'nitzchah Ben Buchri. Shmuel was saying that the Kohanim are allowed to use the salt in response to what Ben Buchri said. Now, what are we talking about? It's not. And this is a Mishnah way back in the first parak of Masechet Shkalim, where said Rabbi Yehuda, this Mishnah Daled in parak Aleph, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, He'id Ben Buchri b'Yavne. Ben Buchri testified in Yavne, which, if you recall, Yavne was an early site of the Beit Din after Yerushalayim, of course, but was an early site. And Ben Buchri testified in Yavne. Now, just the background for 1 minute is that every Jew is supposed to give a machzit shekel, a half a shekel, and the machzit shekel goes to the community, and it pays for karbanot tzibur, which include things like the tamid and the musaf and the salt and the wood and and the heat, the things that the Beit HaMikdash needs to operate. Said Ben Buchri b'Yavna, what about Kohanim? Do Kohanim have to give a machzira shekel? Do they have to pay tax? So said Ben Bukhri, Kol Kohen sheshokel, if a Kohen gives a shekel, eno chote. He didn't commit a sin, which implies he doesn't have to do it. But if he does it, it's okay. It's a nice thing. Okay? Which implies the Kohanim do not have to give machzira shekel. Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in Yavne said to Ben Bukhri, Loki, you're wrong. The Kohen is not optional. Ela kol Kohen she'enu shokel chote. A Kohen who doesn't give a shekel committed a sin, meaning a Kohen has to give a machzira shekel. It's not a nice thing. They got to do it, like everyone else. Why did the Kohanim think otherwise, said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Ela she'kohanim darshin mikra zelatzman. The Kohanim, there's a lot of, there's an interesting discussion. And most hold that Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai was a Kohen, but he was hitting on his brothers here. The Kohanim darshan this pasuk for themselves. What does the pasuk say? This is very relevant for Menachot. Kol minchat kohen kalil tia lo teachel. Pasuk says in Tzav, every mincha of a Kohen is burned completely on the Mizbeach. So said the Kohanim, 1 second, if every mincha that we are part of has to be burned completely, we can't give a gift to the Beit HaMikdash. Because if we give a gift, you have to burn the carbon that comes from our gift. And there's certain carbonot that are carbon tzibor that are eaten. For example, Omer, the carbon Omer on Pesach, and the Shtei Alechem on Atzeret, and the Lechem Apanim at every Shabbos, Shalanuhi. If they belong to us because we paid tax, Heich Nechalim. So therefore you can't eat them. So therefore the Kohanim said, we don't pay taxes. Because if we paid taxes, everything would be messed up. So said Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, they found a really nice loophole for themselves, but they're wrong, right? Says the Gemara, according to Ben Bukhri, right? Ben Bukhri was basically saying that no, that's correct. That Kohanim do not have to pay tax. And if they pay the tax, then it really belongs to them. And they had to make a takana, a t'nai, that even though they don't have to pay the tax, they're allowed to use it. Says Gemara, but if point to Ben Bukhri, how could you make such a t'nai? Ula Ben Bukhri, kivan to the chatchila lo mechayev la'atuye. According to Ben Bukhri, since they are not required to give the machzira shekel, ki maiti nami choteyu. If you bring it, you've done a chet. The kama'ayel chulin la'azara, right? Because you're bringing chulin la'azara. So basically, you're taking something that's not hektish because you're not supposed to give it, and you're saying, okay, but it's okay to give it. That's not allowed. Says Ben Bukhri, no. What would have to happen would be the mighty umasar la'an tzibor. You basically, the Kohanim, bring their shekel, and they say, we are donating this. We don't have to do this. We're giving it of our own free will. It's a donation to the tzibor. Kasal kedai techamina. You might have thought to say, turn the page to Daf Chaf Bet Amud Aleph. You know what? Ki zachilu rachmana li Yisrael di'itlu lishka. When we say in the public use things like salt or wood, right? Every Yisrael has to pay a machzira shekel, and therefore, if you have tax, you get the benefit. You're then allowed to go to the Beit HaMikdash, bring your carbon mincha, and say, "I need a little salt, I need a little wood," and they give it to you because you paid into the tax. So you might think a Yisrael who has to pay the tax, they get a portion of the public use stuff. But the Kohanim, the lishka lo zachi l'rachmana. Maybe the Kohanim who don't have to pay the tax. Now they could if they want to, but they don't have to. So maybe they don't get the benefit, right? You don't pay for the roads, you can't drive on the roads, or you don't pay for the salt, you don't get the benefit from the salt. So you might have thought lo zachi l'rachmana k'mashmalan. Therefore, according to Ben Bukhri, that's the chiddush of the Mishnah, is that they made a special t'nai that even though the Kohanim are not really required to pay taxes, they still get benefit from the public goods that were bought with those taxes. And that's Ben Bukhri's opinion at the end of the day. Again, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, you're wrong, Ben Bukhri. And in fact, the Kohanim have to pay tax, and that's of course how we paskin, that everyone has to give a machzira shekel, and therefore all the things that you buy with the machzira shekel become community property. And to the Kohanim and the Yisrael and Levium, of course, get to use the salt and the wood in the Beit HaMikdash. Tomorrow, we will continue from the second line, I think we're up to. I'm sorry, I'm doing this all online. From the third line of Daf Chaf Bet Amud Aleph, where we ask, why is it so obvious to us today that the wood from the Beit HaMikdash was allowed to be used by everybody? How do we know you don't have to bring your own wood? So we will continue there tomorrow.
Yashar Khan, thank you. Have a great week.
Well, everyone stay warm. Have a great week.